Hello, and welcome to another ADLC digital lesson. Today's lesson is on inheritance and Punnett squares. When you flip a coin, there are two possibilities, tails or heads. But what are the possibilities when you flip a coin twice? Well, let's think about that. You could flip two heads in a row, or you could flip two tails in a row. Another possibility is to flip heads, then tails. And lastly, you could flip tails and then heads. So it looks like if we arrange the coin flipping possibilities, there's a 25% chance we could get one of four possible outcomes when we flip two coins. Understand? Good, because in genetics, it works much the same way. Now you probably already know our genetic information is carried in our DNA. But what you might not know is that information occurs in chunks in the DNA known as genes. The genes carry the information for the specifics of what we look like. For example, what our earlobes might look like. Another interesting thing is that there are two copies of every gene. Remember that chromosomes occur in pairs. You get one from your mother and one from your father. The gene copies are known as alleles. The alleles determine how traits are expressed. For example, let's look at the widow's peak trait. You either have a widow's peak or you don't. The alleles you have determine this. Alleles can express dominance. In the case of widow's peak, if you have the dominant allele, you will have a widow's peak, even if you have the other allele, which is recessive. So what are the allele combinations possible for widow's peak? Well, you could have two dominant alleles, and you'd have a widow's peak. You could have one dominant allele and one recessive allele, and you'd still have a widow's peak. But if you had two copies of the recessive allele, you would not have a widow's peak. You'd have a straight hairline. Let's look at another trait example. We're going to use human earlobes. These will work well. Like widow's peak, there are only two different expressions of this trait. You can have an attached earlobe, or if we look at this man's earlobe, you can see that it is free hanging. Now it turns out that free hanging earlobes are dominant. So if we look at the genotypes for these two individuals, the woman can only be small e. She can only have two recessive alleles. That's why she has attached earlobes. However, if we look at the man, he could have either two or one dominant alleles. Either way, he will have hanging earlobes. Now, what if we wanted to cross these two individuals to see what kind of offspring that they would produce? Would their babies have hanging earlobes or attached earlobes? Well, before we do that, we should get our terms straight. What's really useful for tracking the results of a cross is a Punnett square, and that's simply a block that we use to track the alleles in the cross. We should also be familiar with the terms homozygous and heterozygous. Homozygous means two of the same alleles. So it could be two recessives or two dominants. Both are known as homozygous. Heterozygous refers to when you have two different alleles, one dominant and one recessive. So using the Punnett square is very simple. All we need to do is place the alleles of the two individuals being crossed on two sides of the Punnett square. So let's say that we were using a male who is homozygous dominant. We'd put his alleles on the sides of the Punnett square. And let's say we were crossing that with a female who was heterozygous. So we'd put her alleles across the top of the Punnett square. It then becomes easy for us to see how those alleles would combine to produce offspring. So let's go ahead and do the cross for those two parents and their earlobes. The father being homozygous dominant and the mother being homozygous recessive. Now you can see that the father can only pass down dominant alleles to the babies, and the mother can only pass down recessive alleles. So that means in this case, every time they have a baby, it's always going to be heterozygous. And since each baby has at least one dominant allele, that means 100% chance of having free hanging earlobes for their offspring. So let's do this cross one more time, but this time we'll use a father who is heterozygous. So when we do the allele combinations, we can see that this dominant and this recessive are going to combine to produce a baby that is heterozygous. And since it has a dominant allele, this baby is going to have free hanging earlobes. If we do the rest of the combination possibilities, we see that 50% of the time we end up with heterozygous. 50% of the time we end up with homozygous recessive. So that means the end result of these two parents crossing is a 50% chance of having free hanging earlobes and a 50% chance that the babies are going to have attached earlobes. So what if you want to track the offspring possibilities for two different traits at the same time? Well, you can do that. You're just going to need a Punnett square that's a little bit bigger. For instance, what if we cross two individuals that are both heterozygous for widow's peak and hanging earlobe? Well, let's figure out what the allele combinations are going to look like. So if we take the male, every one of his sperm are going to have a different allele combination possibility. For instance, he could pass down a sperm that has a capital W and a capital E, a dominant for widow's peak and a dominant for hanging earlobe. Another possibility is capital W, small e. Another possibility is small w, capital E. And the last possibility is small w, small e. Now you can see the combinations for the male, and you can see the combinations for the female. Now all we have to do to complete our Punnett square is to put those alleles back together and see what the offspring looks like. So for this one in the corner, we would take our W's and put them together, and our E's and put them together. So obviously, this baby ends up with homozygous dominant for both traits. So this baby is definitely going to have widow's peak and hanging earlobe. So let's just put these alleles back for a moment and challenge you to complete this Punnett square yourself. Remember, when you put the alleles back together in the Punnett square, put the alleles of the same type together. Put the W's together, put the E's together. Then look carefully, see if there's a dominant allele, and if there is, the dominant trait will be expressed. If there isn't a dominant allele, the recessive trait will be expressed. So your last step once you've completed your Punnett square is to count up all the offspring that look similar. So for instance, you'd count up all the babies that have widow's peak and hanging earlobe. For example, you might find that 9 out of 16 in the Punnett square have widow's peak and hanging earlobe. So you could express that as 56%. So in other words, when these two individuals mate, they'd have a 56% chance of producing a widow's peak hanging earlobe baby. Good luck with your Punnett squares.